The ATM screen flickered. Strange. Dan knew his balance should be zero, yet curiosity got the better of him. He selected enter and hit confirm. No error, no insufficient funds message. Instead, the machine whirred and spat out. Account balance unavailable. Withdrawal $200 in cash. Impossible. Had his failed transfer somehow gone through? His credit card was maxed out. Where did this money come from? Drunk but exhilarated, Dan grabbed the cash and stumbled back to the bar, drinking until nearly 1 a.m. As the rain poured on his way home, he took shelter in front of the same ATM. His foggy mind sharpened. What had just happened? He decided to try again. Savings card in. Balance still unavailable. Credit card in. Transfer failed. But when he inserted his savings card once more and withdrew another $200, the ATM paid out again. Dan tested the machine with $400, then $800. Each time, the cash flowed freely. By the end of the night, he had pocketed $2,000 from an account that should have been empty. The next morning, he awoke half believing it was a dream, until he saw the $2,000 in his wallet. But when he checked his bank accounts, something bizarre had happened. His savings account, once zero, was now minus $2,000. His credit card still showed minus $1,995. The withdrawals existed, but there was no record of any transfers. The system had no idea where the money came from, only that it was gone. Had he just robbed a bank without even trying? Dan should have returned the $22,000 to the bank to cover his debt, but after seeing the cash in his wallet, he chose to spend it instead. He went shopping, bought a new refrigerator, and later treated his friends at the bar. By the end, he had only $300 left. Rather than paying off any debt, he gambled the remaining $300 on horse races. He lost everything. Now, in debt and broke, he reflected on the night he had managed to withdraw $2,000 from the ATM. Dan had a sharp mind for technical systems. He wasn't a hacker, but he was curious. He realized timing was key. His withdrawal happened after midnight, so he tested it again. After his shift, he went to the ATM. His savings account showed $22,000. His credit card was nearly maxed out, but he tried transferring $1,000. An error appeared, but his savings balance dropped to minus $11,000, meaning the transfer had worked. He repeated the process. Each time, an error message appeared, but his savings balance increased. Eventually, he withdrew another $2,000. The next morning, his balance was still zero, but by the following day, it corrected to minus $4,000. This meant the system took over 24 hours to fix errors. Dan realized that by withdrawing money each night before the system corrected itself, he could keep his account at zero. If he took out $2,000 one night, he could repeat the process the next, always staying ahead of the correction. However, he also knew that if his account reached minus $20,000, the bank would freeze it. The flaw was a ticking time bomb. The ATM allowed Dan to transfer up to $999,000 in one transaction, and he could repeat the process nightly. Missing even one night would turn all previous withdrawals negative, exposing him to the bank. To keep the cycle going, he withdrew money every night. He even discovered he could use any ATM from the bank. Dan justified his actions by believing he was taking from a corrupt institution rather than a person. He told no one, not even his fiancée. Within a week, he had withdrawn $20,000, treating friends, buying drinks, and betting on horse races. He claimed to be winning big, but in reality, he was losing heavily. His losses grew to $40,000. One day at work, the betting site flagged his unusually high wagers, suspecting fraud. The bar owner checked the safe, but found no missing money. However, the large sums raised suspicions, leading to Dan's betting account being closed and his firing. Rumors spread. People suspected he was involved in illegal activities, possibly even drug dealing. His friends cut ties with him. Dan, now jobless in a small town, was quickly ostracized after news of his actions spread. His fiancée ended the relationship via text, unwilling to be associated with him. Seeking someone to confide in, Dan told his friend Mark about the ATM loophole, but Mark chose not to get involved, though they remained friends. The two went to Melbourne, where Dan enjoyed his newfound wealth but continued making daily withdrawals. At a casino, they gambled thousands, living luxuriously. Mark left for work, and Dan stayed, facing the challenge of ATM limits. To access larger sums, Dan decided to visit the bank and withdraw $100,000. He nervously tested the waters by first withdrawing small amounts, then bigger sums. The third time, he successfully withdrew the large amount, breaking the ATM limit. Realizing he could access unlimited funds, Dan lived extravagantly, inviting friends and treating them to luxury. He shared the ATM loophole with two friends, but one chose to stay uninvolved. They spent lavishly, renting limousines, helicopters, and penthouses. Dan was generous, even paying off friends' debts and giving away money to strangers who moved him, like musicians and elderly couples. Dan had resigned himself to a domestic trip within Australia when he received $40,000 in cash, turning his dream of visiting Hawaii into reality. Boldly, he also helped homeless people, putting them up in luxurious hotels for the night. This act gave him a sense of happiness, while alleviating some of his guilt. Yet he wasn't just generous to others. He and his friends visited upscale stores and bought the most expensive items, including high-end perfumes. He even paid for all the bills at one of the city's top restaurants, despite patrons typically not needing such generosity. When asked if he was the wealthiest in Australia, Dan confidently replied, "I'm probably in 7th place." As his spending grew, Dan's boldest act came when he rented a private plane for $90,000 and bought an entire island near Bali. He entrusted his bank cards to a friend to continue his lavish lifestyle, all while being paranoid about getting caught. But Dan continued to act fearlessly, withdrawing over $1.6 million in 4 months, convinced that he would eventually be caught. Eventually, weary of the pressure, Dan decided to stop. He made his final withdrawal, offering his friends whatever they wanted, and left his bank account in the negative by $1.6 million. His boldness didn't stop there. He spent days waiting for the police to arrive, but despite the threats from the bank, they never came. After 2 years of waiting under constant threat, Dan boldly took his story public. He reached out to prominent newspapers and eventually appeared on a popular Australian TV show, hoping to escalate the matter. Despite his risky move, the bank's inaction remained, and Dan continued to wait, trapped in a cycle of bold decisions with no clear resolution. Dan thought that once his story aired on a popular TV show, the bank would have no choice but to respond. With millions of viewers watching, he eagerly awaited the broadcast. But what he didn't expect was the show's producers to sensationalize the story, announcing that he was now a fugitive and urging people to report his whereabouts. Dan was left astounded, as the arrest narrative was completely fabricated, just for dramatic effect. On the same night of the broadcast, one of the producers emailed him, expressing pleasure in meeting him and inviting him to collect the photos and documents from the shoot. Sensing something was off, Dan went to the TV station, only to be ambushed by photographers and arrested by a police officer who had no knowledge of the case. The arrest was staged, with the producer calling in the officer to make the arrest for the cameras. The truth: the police had never been investigating him, and the bank had never even reported the theft. Dan learned that the bank had avoided involvement to prevent a scandal about a security flaw that allowed the theft of over $1.6 million. If the details had been exposed, it could have caused a massive loss of customer trust. The case went to court, but since the bank refused to participate, the prosecutor took over. The result: a mere year in prison for Dan, despite the magnitude of the theft. Since his release, Dan has appeared in TV interviews and is writing a book about his experience. When asked if he kept any of the stolen money, Dan declined to comment, leaving the true amount a mystery. What do you think? If you discovered such a flaw in a bank's system, would you have done the same? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more jaw-dropping stories.